Okay, folks, so you got refreshed, and now we have another incredible event here. As I was starting to say before this break, I think you'll see that there's a theme that emerges in this conference, and a lot of the work we're doing at the community level, the response to problems of pesticide dependency, really come down to the way we treat the earth and the ecosystem and the soil. So in reviewing your book, which is an incredible book, which you'll describe in detail, Kristin Ohlson, the author of The Soil Will Save Us, she has a background in journalism and has written extensively and traveled around the world and brought the international element to this question of the soil. But I think what I took away from your book was the sense that there's a complexity in the soil represents the complexity of the problem and the simplicity of the solution. And I think if we think about it in that way, it's really a hopeful story. So I'm sure you're going to tell us about all the horrible ways we've treated the soil, but the hopefulness in what's being done around the country and around the world to reverse that. So thank you so much for being here, and welcome, Kristin Ohlson.
I'm not used to having technology that works, so we'll see. This is so fancy. It's really such a pleasure to be here, although awfully daunting to be taking the stage after Rachel Carson. Okay, that play was amazing. I still have a little tear in my eye. So a few months ago, I did something. I flew from Portland to Cincinnati, where there was a book fair, which is like 300 authors speed dating with 3,000 book buyers. And on my way there, I did something that I don't usually do, which is that I read my book cover to cover for the first time in a couple of years. So the book came out 2 years ago, and up in the period of time leading up to that, I read it over and over and over and over again. Fact checking, looking for typos, all that, and I had this terrible fear that I would be speaking about the book someplace, and afterwards somebody would say, on page 97, you said blah blah blah, and I would think, oh God, I don't remember what I wrote on page 97. And so I thought, I better read the book again. So I sat there on the plane and I read the book, and it was funny what happened, because what happened was that I started to cry. I started to get all weepy, and I had to press my face into the window looking out so that people couldn't watch. And it wasn't like it wasn't just because I had found more typos. Of course they were there. But it was this material. It's just this amazing material, this amazing, hopeful material that I feel so honored and lucky to be writing about. Honored and lucky to be writing about it, honored and lucky to be meeting the people who are doing it. And the material is soil and how alive it is and the implications that it has for life on our planet. And for our air, and for our food, and for our health, and for our climate. And writing the book changed me forever, because it brought me into contact with this passionate group of people, activists, scientists, farmers, chefs, doctors, food people, and more, who gave me hope that we as humans can finally start to live in harmony with nature and stop screwing up the planet. So let's see. I grew up there. I grew up in the Sacramento Valley, and that's what all the farming looked like. Or actually, this is a not bad look at what the farming looked like. It would be bare fields for miles and miles and miles alongside the road. So from our house in Oroville in the Sacramento Valley, we could look out and see all that stuff going on out in the valley. And my grandparents were farmers, and my parents my father was involved with local agriculture, and my parents were also these crazy avid gardeners, you know, who had to visit every single fruit stand and vegetable stand in the state, you know, and they could never drive a straight line from one part of the state to the other because they had to zigzag around and go to all their favorite farm stands. But as much as my grandparents knew about farming and my parents knew about gardening, they didn't really know anything about soil. And as interested as I've always been in organic gardening in my own yard and buying it as much as I could, I didn't know anything about soil until a few years ago, until this guy started talking to me. And he is a chef in Cleveland, and I had written an article for him for Gourmet magazine because he was one of those early chefs who was really interested in bringing local, sustainable, seasonal food into his restaurant. And he had kind of completely reinvented the pipeline, the way that food got into restaurants. And other chefs in Cleveland and the farmers market in Cleveland, everybody sort of caught on to his coattails. So he was this amazing guy. He had grown up on a dairy farm in Ohio, and he really had a lot of respect for farmers, and he had a lot of respect for the way they raised food. And he was convinced that the quality of the food that they raised was directly related to how good he could make the food in his restaurant. So I stayed in touch with him, such an interesting guy. And I was always calling him up and saying, hey, Parker, what's going on in food and agriculture that I should know about? What's interesting? And at one point he said, carbon farming, that's what you should be writing about. And he said, some people call it sunshine farming, some people call it microbe farming. I kind of more now call it the soil health movement. He said, but that was what some of these really progressive farmers that he was meeting and working with were talking about. And it's farming that, sort of simply stated, it's trying to build up the amount of carbon in the soil instead of depleting it and ruining it, which is what most of our agriculture does. So what I developed in the course of writing this book, and what I hope to share with all of you, was this profound sense of wonder about what's going on under our feet. I really walk on the earth differently after learning all this stuff. I read recently that scientists think that there are 300 sextillion stars. So that's a 3 followed by 23 zeros. So lots and lots of stars. But down in the soil, there is an incredible density of microorganisms, an incredible 6 billion or so in a teaspoon of healthy soil. So 6 billion, it's impossible, for me at least, to get it's like contemplating infinity. It's just impossible to imagine that much life in such a small space. So anyway, I'm guessing that there are more than 300 sextillion microorganisms, more than all the stars in the sky, just under Portland, Maine. And these microorganisms have been found more than 10 miles down, but they're especially active around the roots of plants, which can go down quite far. I mean, this is 6 feet, but they go down farther. We can't see these microorganisms, but they're busy making a living down there. And everything that we have and want above ground depends on what they do down there. So I also want you to walk away from my talk with reasonable new hope about our environment. Working on this book and learning about the promise of soil allowed me to take heart. I never doubted the global warming science for a minute. Although I often wish the projections were wrong, because it was just much easier to lead your ordinary life without that constant clamor of doom going off. And it was, the worst of convictions, because it was really obvious that people weren't doing any of the things that scientists and activists said that we should be doing in a dramatic and immediate way to halt the buildup of CO2 in the environment. And I didn't realize it when I started working on this book, but the early climate science projections failed to take into account something huge, and that's soil. Most of us don't take soil into account. We think of land as this very thin crust over a big hunk of dead rock hurtling through space. And even though I've been a gardener all my adult life, and my parents, were gardeners, and my grandparents were farmers, even though I have that connection to soil that goes back generations, I had no idea how alive the soil was. And when I would hear things like, the soil is alive, I would think about things like earthworms, and beetles, and ants, and things like that, and think, okay, well, they're living down there. But those things are like the leviathans of the soil. They're the great blue whales, and the giant squids, and the giant white sharks. It's what we don't see that makes the soil so incredibly alive. The tiniest life forms that have been there long before these other creatures evolved and are crucial to the way our planet functions as one great ecosystem. And we're crucial to this lush, beautiful world developing at all. So I was at a conference of soil microbiologists in France, and this one was talking about, trying to get the public engaged in soil and seeing the importance of these soil microorganisms. And he said, but look at them, they're so ugly. They're not like a panda bear. Nobody cares. So this recognition of the soil microorganisms' importance is pretty new. And I think it's very much like the recognition of the importance of the microorganisms that live on and in the human body. So our fear of germs, which is epitomized by the hand sanitizers, on display in every grocery store, in every office, everywhere, they're everywhere. It's just crazy given the fact that our bodies have 10 times as many bacterial cells as human cells. And I think the latest count that I've seen about the human microbiome is that it's mostly concentrated in the gut, but really all over us, is 100 trillion. So we are a ship of microbes, and one that was pretty much designed and built by the microbes themselves. And actually the correct word for us and most other life forms is a supraorganism. We are an organism made up of many organisms. So all the living things that we can see, which is only a small percentage of the living things, are supraorganisms, with a lot of the essential work being done by those invisible microbial partners. And it's not like we just have that one big microbiome in our gut, although that's where the most important and biggest concentration is. They're all over us, and they're all a little different from each other. The microbiome on our teeth is different from the microbiome in our gingival pockets. The microbiome on the skin on our arms is different from the one between our toes. And both of those are different from the ones in our hair follicles, but we probably need, or at least coexist with them all. And if you took all those microbes out of our body, and they'd fill a half-gallon jug and weigh several pounds, and scientists now think that those microbes are crucial to our body's functioning, to our digestion and to our immune system and to our metabolism and even to the way our brain works, So some scientists are talking about depression might someday be treated by some combination of probiotics or, that kind of approach. And it's kind of amazing that doctors were able to help people at all, like about 10 or 15 years ago, before this stuff started becoming more in common parlance, because they didn't understand. It's all really new stuff. They didn't understand that we need that microbial community. We need it to be vigorous, and we need it to be in a certain balance. And of course, it's not like they're all benevolent partners. Some are just hangers-on. And a few are pathogens, but as one of my favorite researchers likes to point out, if they all meant us harm, they overwhelm us so, by their numbers so vastly that we'd be toast if most of them did, so they don't. And just as people are starting to understand the importance of that microbial population in our body, we have to all really start understanding, from ordinary people to professionals to policymakers, that Earth's microbiome is even more dense and diverse and essential. And the only way we can live on this Earth without destroying it is to figure out how to live in harmony with that vast, invisible, but incredibly powerful biological force. So healthy soil has a vigorous population of microorganisms. I'll go backwards and see them. Bacteria, fungi, protozoa, microarthropods, nematodes, and other tiny creatures. Scientists have known that they're there for a while, but it's not until fairly recently that they understood why they were there and what role they play. And what keeps emerging from this work is this incredible partnership, an ancient partnership between plants and soil microorganisms. And this partnership developed, this partnership created the growing world that modern humans evolved in around 276,000 years ago, and it set the stage for us and other mammals. And the microorganisms have been in the soil for around 2 billion years. When plants moved from water to land about 500 million years ago, they tapped into an already existing system for cycling nutrients and water. So what are the terms of this partnership? So most people already know about photosynthesis. It's the great biological marvel of our planet, begun by bacteria, cyanobacteria, around 2.4 billion years ago in what's often called the Great Oxygenation Event, which changed our atmosphere into one that we can breathe, the one that we have now. And we can thank them for the air in our lungs. So photosynthesis is carried on by both plants and bacteria, and both create oxygen. But when plants conduct photosynthesis, they perform another function that's critical for keeping this world we inherited in balance. They use the energy from sunlight to pull carbon dioxide out of our atmosphere, and they toss off the oxygen. They don't need that. That's their waste product. And they convert that carbon dioxide into a carbon-based fuel, a sugary fuel, that they use to grow their stems and trunks and leaves and flowers and fruit. When we eat those plants, we're feasting on the carbon that used to be floating around in the atmosphere. It used to be there, now it's in the pomegranates and in the sweet potatoes and in the flesh of the animals that eat those plants. And this is the really critical part. Plants don't use all of that carbon to fuel their own growth. So about 40%, and sometimes more, some researchers say, is sent down to the roots. And there, plants feed soil microorganisms this wonderful carbon fuel, and in exchange, the soil microorganisms bring plants the nutrients that they have, the mineral nutrients that they've liberated from rock and sand and silt and clay. And that's been the deal for millions of years. It's a partnership, it's a trade. And it's really a foundational partnership in nature, if not the foundational partnership. There are other partnerships in nature that we know about because we can observe them with the naked eye. But until recently, we didn't really have the technology to observe the partnership between these soil microorganisms and plants. So it's tempting, when we see a plant poking up out of the soil to think, well, here's this one living thing just poking up there out of the soil. But now we're starting to understand that when we see a plant, we're looking at the very top part of a very complex ecosystem. And that if our vision could penetrate the soil, we'd be looking down at something like a Rio de Janeiro or a New York City or a Paris busily at work underneath the soil. In fact, we'd probably see dozens of communities, dozens of overlapping communities, just as in Paris, there's one group of people that go to a certain church and one group of people that go off and do a certain kind of work. There's all that kind of overlapping complexity and busyness going on down there in the soil. So there are some 98 naturally occurring elements on our planet, and it's possible that plants need every single one of them in varying amounts, and not just the handful of nutrients that we give them in chemical fertilizers. And the way they've always gotten those nutrients is through that partnership with microorganisms. So when you walk in the woods or in a meadow that people haven't plowed up and people haven't turned to some other use, and you see plants growing in a mad profusion there, even in the middle of a drought, plants just growing in a mad profusion. Do you ever think, how are those things being fertilized? Why are they growing so well? Well, it is that relationship with microbes that's making them grow. So that's how the plant's partnership with soil microorganisms fertilizes the plant. And that partnership is also the main way that carbon gets into the soil. So the microorganisms eat that carbon fuel that they're getting from the roots of the plants, And then they excrete it, and other microorganisms eat them and excrete it, and the carbon fuel, all that carbon that's coming down in the soil that came from the plant's roots gets concentrated and tucked away in the soil and gets stuck there. Not all of it, a small percentage, but it's enough of a percentage to make a huge difference. And here's another way that carbon gets concentrated in the soil. The soil microorganisms make a kind of carbon glue to build tiny structures in the soil to protect themselves and to, make reservoirs of water and control gas going through the soil. They're like little micro-engineers of the soil. So they engineer the soil and wind up creating what I like to think of as stacks of billions and billions of cups and saucers in the soil, just there that can hold, keeping open spaces in the soil and that can hold water. Or another way to think of it is like that soil, good soil is like a coral reef. We have this thing that we always say, I'm standing on solid ground, this is solid ground. Well, it's not that solid. There's a lot of space in good soil, and it's all created by these microorganisms taking that carbon glue, making a carbon glue from the fuel that they get from plants, and sort of converting the soil into a giant sponge. So good soil is full of that kind of structure, and it's all held together by carbon. And carbon-rich soil is dark, because it's carbon. And we know instinctively that dark soil is good soil. And, I'm always amused when I'm walking around my neighborhood, and I live in Portland, Oregon now, but before that I lived in Cleveland, Ohio, and it was the same thing going on in both places. In the spring you start to see people toting home these great big bags of mulch and things that they're getting from the garden store, and a lot of these things are dyed black. There's a dye in there. But it's because we just know that that's kind of what's good soil. Good soil has that darkness to it. And we don't realize that it's carbon that's doing that because, especially since, the alarms about global warming have gone off, we think that carbon is a bad thing. I was talking to somebody about my book, and I was talking about carbon in the soil, and she said, oh, poor soil. No, carbon is really essential. It's just that there's way too much in the atmosphere and not enough in the soil. So good soil is also knitted together by microscopic mats of fungi which pierce the roots of plants and share water and nutrients and chemical messages and chemical signals back and forth within a plant community. And the hyphae from the fungi can run for 250 feet or more and make this information highway going on under the ground. I met a researcher who works in the Pacific Northwest studying forests, and she found she's found many really fascinating things about how the fungi link together plant communities. But one of the things is that older trees help infant trees struggling in the shade. So they shunt them water and nutrients through this fungal network to help those small plants grow. So it makes sense that healthy soil, with all those cups and saucers and channels created by the fungi, it's very porous. And because of that structure, they can receive and hold water in a way that unhealthy soil can't. And that's important because we're all worried about rainfall these days. We worry about how little of it we get, and we worry about too much. And so healthy soil handles both of those concerns. And this is a slide from the National Resources Conservation Service. For every 1% increase in soil organic matter, which builds up through that partnership between plants and soil microorganisms, an acre of soil can hold an extra 25,000 gallons of water. So if the rains don't come, the soil is still holding that water from the last rain event. And if it rains 8 inches in a couple of hours, the soil can absorb it and it doesn't all run off into the streams. That's another one of their slides. But the problem is that almost everything that we humans have done to the land ever since agriculture began, 10,000, 12,000 years ago, has disrupted that ancient partnership between plants and soil microorganisms. So it's not just a problem with modern chemical agriculture, even though that's the most efficient way to ruin soil that we've ever come up with. As soon as we domesticated wild herds and changed the way they move over the land, and as soon as we started to dig up the earth and to plow to plant our seeds, as soon as we started to eliminate the great diversity of plants from the landscape to make room for the one crop that we wanted to grow, and that's called a monoculture, as soon as we started keeping the land bare around that one crop, as soon as we started to interrupt the feeding relationship between plants and soil microorganisms with chemical fertilizer, that's a big problem. You know, people often think that people think mostly about the pesticides that are used in agriculture and think that those, you know, that's the only objectionable thing going on, or that's the most objectionable thing going on because, you know, using something that kills things to raise food just seems so wrong. But fertilizers, chemical fertilizers, are also a problem too. And I was just looking at some new research that came out in the last couple of days that showed that nitrogen fertilizer actually makes genetic changes in bacteria that naturally pull nitrogen out of the atmosphere and fix it into the soil and make it available to plants. So when we use nitrogen fertilizer, we are actually ruining, you know, destroying nature's own way of getting nitrogen to plants. So when we started doing all these things, we started disrupting that ancient partnership. And we started liberating carbon from the soil and sending it off into the sky. And some scientists estimate that 80 billion tons of carbon have been lost from the world's soils because of human activity on the land. Ancient humans warmed the climate so much with the way they use the land that one scientist thinks that we averted another ice age 2,000 years ago. And today, you know, the figures are a little, it sort of depends on who's counting and how, but today land use related to agriculture accounts for about 30% of the carbon and other greenhouse gases going up into the atmosphere. So all that carbon that's in the atmosphere is called the legacy load, and the climate change conversation that goes on around the world erroneously focuses on the 2 parts per million of carbon dioxide that human activity keeps adding to the atmosphere every year. We talk a lot about reducing that, which is, of course, essential. It absolutely has to be done. But the conversation doesn't pay enough attention to that legacy load, the carbon that's already there. And even if we did everything that we're supposed to do and stopped all fossil fuel emissions right now, I mean, it's not going to happen because we're not even close, but even if we managed to do that right now, the legacy load of carbon dioxide that's in the atmosphere would continue to warm the planet for decades, if not centuries. So we're absolutely cooked if we don't do something to draw down that carbon dioxide that's already in the atmosphere. And the best way to do that, the cheapest and most widely available technology, the technology that's been at it for a very long time without glitches or unintended consequences, is the technology that nature invented millions of years ago, plant photosynthesis, which removes carbon from the air, and the partnership that plants carry on with the soil microorganisms, which fixes part of that carbon in the soil. So how much carbon can be fixed in the soil? That's also sort of a moving number. There's not nearly enough research done on this stuff, as not enough research being done on sustainable agriculture, just not enough research. But I had a conversation a couple of months ago with Ratan Lal, who's a really highly esteemed soil scientist, and he was maybe the first person to get the connection between the carbon that was being released into the atmosphere by bad farming and the buildup of carbon that was warming the atmosphere. So I talked to him a couple of months ago about how much carbon can be fixed in the soil. So he told me that the best research he's seen so far shows that using very simple agricultural techniques in combination, and in this case he meant no-till agriculture and coupled with cover crops, that we can draw down and sequester as much as 1.5 tons of carbon for every 2.5 acres. But I know that there are other scientists out there with much more optimistic scenarios. One guy's research indicates that we could sequester 10 tons per acre, also using simple techniques. Our biggest impact on the environment is through agriculture. In our croplands, which is 4 billion acres around the world, and in our pastures and rangelands, which is about 14 billion acres around the world. Because of the kind of farming practiced by conventional agriculturalists, the soil in most of our croplands is sick, biologically sick. According to Rattan Lal, 1/4 of the Earth's landmass is degraded and sick from human activity. But so we can take that really shocking number, 1/4 of the Earth's landmass, and instead of being depressed by it, even though it's very depressing, we can look at that and look at that as a huge opportunity, that we can, we know that using a combination of simple agricultural methods and stopping the damaging ones, we can heal soil and draw down massive amounts of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and that degraded land that's been stripped of its carbon is a prime target. So is anyone doing this? Yes, so that's what I wrote about in my book, and that's what the soil health movement is all about, and it's going on around the world. And it's, I think it's really important to point out that all these soil health pioneers who are doing this stuff, they're not all doing it because they're trying to save the planet. And trying to avert or reverse global warming. Some of them don't believe that human activity has caused global warming, but, whatever. They're doing it to make their land more resilient, to grow better food, to stop erosion, to save water, because healthy soil saves us in so many ways. So the movement for soil health, I think that most of them would describe it as trying to farm, is trying to mimic nature in agriculture and protect that, and especially protect that, really focus on that ancient partnership between plants and soil microorganisms. So when I first started working on my book, I think I probably first contacted scientists and said, well, what kind of work are you doing on this? And not Rattan Lal, but some of these other scientists were really quick to say, well, science isn't really doing enough. The scientists are really lagging behind. It's these really progressive, innovative farmers who are doing a lot of the work. And so I went to a conference called the Quivira Conference in Albuquerque, which brings together ranchers and conservationists and scientists and various activists. And when I was there, I met this young guy who was at that point working for the National Wildlife Federation, and I told him what I was interested in, and he said, and he was working on a brochure, a report for the National Wildlife Federation about what they called future-friendly farming. Farming that was employing practices that were making land healthier instead of ruining it. And so he told me that Gabe Brown of North Dakota was just the most amazing farmer he had run into around the country. So Gabe became the centerpiece farmer of my book. So he has a 5,000-acre farm outside Bismarck, North Dakota, where he gets about 16.5 inches of rain per year. And he began to dramatically change his farming like 15, 17 years ago. I've kind of lost track of how long it is, but I think it's about 15 years ago. So he began as a conventional farmer. He didn't come from a farm family, but he married somebody who was a farmer's daughter, and he had always liked the idea of farming. He liked working outside, so he became a farmer. And unlike the guys at my farmer's market, he didn't get into farming to save the world. He went into farming because he liked it and because he wanted to make a good living. And he started off conventional. He started off going to ag school, and what they teach you at ag school is, to till and to apply chemicals at certain designated times, and so he learned all that, and that's how he got started. He did stop tilling because he noticed that his soil just got so dry after he tilled, and he knew some farmers who were no-till, and so he started talking to them, and he decided he was going to go no-till. He sold his tilling equipment, he bought no-till drills, and made that transition early. And then he was doing okay, and then he had this epic 4 years. It just always seems to me like biblical in nature, this epic 4 years of terrible, terrible luck. 1 year, drought wiped out his crop, and he had nothing to take, nothing to sell, nothing to take to market. The next year, hail wiped out his crop, and he had nothing to take to market. The next year, a late frost wiped out his crop, and he had nothing to take to market. And next year, another drought wiped out his crop. He had nothing to take to market. Then he couldn't afford any of the chemicals that he had been applying, so he just stopped doing it. And instead of taking his machinery into the fields to clean up the ruined crops, he sent his cattle in to clean up the ruined crops. And he started to plant cover crops in the fall. He thought he wanted to protect what decent soil there was left, and so he started planting cover crops in the fall. And cover crops, just in case anybody doesn't know, that's what farmers for generations, this is not a recent thing, but it's not a widely practiced thing either. For generations, farmers have planted cover crops to protect the soil from wind and water erosion, and usually when their fields are fallow. So it's a soil preservation technique, although, now that we all know what's going on when a plant has roots in the soil and what it's doing, that it's pumping that carbon fuel down to the soil microorganisms, we know now that cover crops do a lot more than just protect soil. They're actually keeping that ecosystem under the soil line alive. So he found, doing these things, going no-till and with the cover crops, he found that his soil was changing, that it was becoming richer and darker and holding more moisture and becoming more resilient. And he was really lucky. He considers himself lucky that he had these 4 terrible years now. He says now, if he hadn't had those 4 terrible years, he would not have been pushed to make a change. But he was also lucky in another way. He had a really active soil conservationist working in his county from the Natural Resources Conservation Service, and he had a really active soil microbiologist working there who was with the Agricultural Research Service, Chris Nichols, who's now the science director of the Rodale Institute. So there was like this little soil health triumvirate that started there. And he started to try to figure out if he could figure out if nature would do all the things that he used to do with the chemicals and the tillage and all that kind of stuff. He wondered if he could continue to not have chemicals. And he started to understand, through working with these 2 people, that his soil had become more resilient because he wasn't losing the carbon through tillage, and that the carbon that was feeding the microorganisms and providing a home for them. And he wasn't destroying that coral reef, those cups and saucers, and he wasn't destroying those mats of mycorrhizal fungi with tilling. And he realized that his cover crops were keeping that underground community of microorganisms healthy by feeding them carbon fuel through their roots. So he increased his use of cover crops. He now uses what he calls cover crop cocktails, and they can be mixes of up to 25, or I think I just read something lately that he had a field where he had 70 different cover crops in there. And again, he's trying to mimic nature. So in nature, nature doesn't have monocultures. Nature has these intense diversity. In the virgin prairie near where he lives, somebody went and counted the number of species that were in a square foot, and it was 140. So he's trying to make his land as diverse as possible. Sure, he might be growing corn, but between those rows of corn, he has all these different cover crops going. And he realizes that cattle can have a healthy impact on the land if they're managed properly. Oh, I was supposed to have shown that slide a while ago. Anyway, that's his farm. They're dropping their microbe-laden dung on the land and their nitrogen-rich urine, and they're stomping down plants so that the soil microorganisms can get to them. So they're stomping down plants so that they turn into sort of a mulch for the soil, for the microorganisms. So he increased his number of cattle, and he rotates them through, making sure that they're only there long enough to have that beneficial impact, but not so long that they eat all the plants and stop the photosynthesis. And he always talks about managing 2 herds on his land. So he's got his cattle, and now he also has sheep, and now he also has chickens. So he's got those animals that we then eat, but he also has what he considers the herds of microorganisms underground. And of the 2, he says that the herd of microorganisms is the most important herd and the one that he manages for. So at this point, as a farmer, he uses no fertilizer, no pesticides, no fungicide, no herbicide, none of those other sides to prepare a new field. So if he gets a new field from another farmer who's farmed it conventionally, he'll plant it with these intense, crazy cover crop cocktails that include everything from, 12-foot-high sunflowers to radishes. And he'll raise up that crop of cover crops for a while and send his cattle in, and that's how he builds fertility in that land. So, and what are the results for him as a farmer? So now he gets 27 more bushels of corn per acre than the county average, but he only so more than the county average, but he only spends $1.25 to produce that bushel versus $3.50 for the county average. The organic matter in his soil has gone from 1.7% to 5.3%. Actually, I think that's way low now. And his son wants to take it much higher. And in a time when we all worry about water, too much or not enough, this is another really remarkable change. So something like 20 years ago, he had a soil infiltration test done on, or a water infiltration test done on his soil, where they measure just how long it takes water to percolate down into the soil. And so when he had that test done 20 years ago, only a half an inch would percolate down in an hour. That's how compacted and crappy the soil was. And now he's at 15 inches in an hour. 15 inches the soil will suck up. And the soil sucks up that water. The first inch goes down in 9 seconds, the second inch in 16 seconds. So altogether 2 inches in 25 seconds. And Gabe and his son, Paul, don't worry about irrigating. They say they don't worry about drought. Their land is kind of like a sponge that holds all the water that's needed that falls until it's needed. Because it doesn't matter how much rain falls if the soil won't hold the water. When the rain falls on compacted, degraded soil, it just runs off towards the nearest low point in the watershed and takes soil and any contaminants that are there with it. And when farmers take steps to build the health of their soil, there are so many other benefits. So one of the things that he doesn't worry about is corn rootworm, which is a problem with so many farmers. When we walked through his fields, and things were just crawling all over us. And Jonathan Lundgren, who's going to be speaking tomorrow, and I can't wait I talked to him for the book, and it was nice to actually meet him tonight. He did what I wish more scientists would do. He went to this healthy, thriving farm that doesn't use chemicals and tilling, and studied why it's so successful. So he concluded that the reason that Gabe's farm isn't bothered by insect pests is because he has all these flowering cover crops, and they are attracting hordes of beneficial insects that are killing off the pest insects. And they're not only killing off the pest insects, but some of these insects that are being drawn to his farm are what are called granivores, meaning that they eat tiny seeds, like tiny weed seeds that fall out there. So they're actually protecting him from weed incursions. So I just really love that. For me, all of that expresses the beauty and the promise of good agriculture. People who study nature carefully and work with the relationships and partnerships that exist there, and instead of trying to break up those partnerships and relationships and substitute what we think is a better idea, work with them, understand them. So Here's another example of a farmer who's thriving by working with nature instead of fighting it. So I visited this guy at his Oregon farm last year, and we were walking around in his fields, and he pointed to this one plant that was growing there. There it is, curly dock, and he said, that plant almost ruined me a couple of years ago. And I said, why? And he said, it's considered a weed, and it was spreading through his fields like crazy. It's very, very invasive, and it was displacing grass, and his cattle wouldn't eat it. He's a dairy farmer, so his cattle wouldn't, and grass-fed dairy, and his cattle wouldn't eat it, so they would, like walk away from the curly dock and eat the little bit of grass that was remaining, and he was kind of desperate because the amount of grass in his fields was diminishing, the curly dock was growing, the cattle wouldn't eat it, and it was really a big problem for him. He's organic, so he couldn't spray, which is what all his neighbors were doing. So he would get out there every once in a while and mow it, mow the curly dock before it set seed. But it was, a lot of work, and it would disrupt the wildlife that was living there, and he hated doing it. And then, sort of coincidentally, he decided that he wanted to diversify the plants that were growing in his fields. And so he seeded plantain and chicory in his in with all the grasses and stuff that were there, because he knew that they were nutritious, and they were they have a reputation for being a natural preventive for intestinal parasites for cows. So he planted them in there, and the cattle, went ahead and ate them. And then they moved on to the curly dock and started eating the curly dock. And it turned out that these new plants that he had seeded in there were on, the cows wouldn't eat the curly dock because it's a bitter weed. And the plantain and the chicory were sort of on that bitter spectrum, but not as bitter. And once he had convinced them he didn't even have to work hard at it, but once they had experimented with that bitter spectrum, they kind of thought, well, the curly dock is not that bad. So now his cattle just eat all the curly dock, and it's actually quite nutritious for them. And I just love that. I think that a lot of times in farming, as in probably many other things, we get this idea that this is what works, that this is what the animals will eat, that this is, actually there's a researcher, a farm educator who works with farmers and ranchers on training their cows to eat weeds. And she was telling me that, like 100 years ago, there was some paper about what do cows really like to eat? And this paper said, well, they like to eat something like stewed parsnips or something like that. We have these ideas about nature being really rigid, but here the cows will eat the curly dock. So I think that this is a really hopeful and exciting time. I think the stuff that's going on in agriculture is really hopeful and exciting. Gabe is really only one example of farmers that are doing well with this approach. And the approach being really trying to protect and nurture that partnership between plants and soil microorganisms, and generally mimic nature and work with nature as much as possible. And he has visitors from all over the world, and he's invited to speak at conferences all the time. And I think that the message that these guys are taking out to the rest of us is that, that we're always given this false dichotomy about our food and about our agriculture, that we can have good food or enough food, and good agriculture or productive agriculture, and healthy landscapes or landscapes that have all this tilling and chemicals and that aren't very healthy. And these guys are showing us that we can have good food, good agriculture, and healthy landscapes. I don't know if all you know this, but 2015 was declared by the UN the International Year of Soil. So soil is now being discussed with great enthusiasm all over the globe. I learned a few months after my book came out that the Natural Resources Conservation Service has had this soil health campaign going since 2012, and they're, going around to farmers and farm educators around the country, talking about all this stuff. So it's really exciting. And they kicked off their campaign on an Ohio farmer's land. And he's a guy who came back from Vietnam 40 years ago, and I can't even remember why he started no-till, but he started no-till, and he's now really into cover crops, and he does all these experiments on his land about if he plants a certain cover crop, how that changes the nutrients that are concentrated, that those plants concentrate in their roots and then are available for other plants. So I visited him last year, and just a couple of weeks after I was there, the French Minister of Agriculture visited him, and then at the climate talks last December, France, came to the climate talks with a proposal called the 4 for 1,000 initiative, and it calls for increasing the amount of carbon in our soils by 0.4% every year to halt the increase of CO2 in the atmosphere. So this was really historic that soil was finally on the stage as being a climate solution. So I think it's a really hopeful time. So I'll just end with a quote from this guy, Peter Donovan. Does anybody know Peter? Yeah. So I spent some time with him when I was working on the book, and he has mounted something called the Soil Carbon Challenge, and he travels all over the country measuring the carbon content of soil on farms and ranches, and monitors how, through their management practices, they increase the soil carbon, and somebody will get a prize after 10 years or 12 years. And I met him sort of towards the end of the research that I had been doing on the book, and I told him that I was so amazed because everybody I talked to in this soil health movement was so optimistic, and I was used to everybody being just bummed out. All of my friends were just depressed and anxious about the state of the world and the state of the environment, and all these soil health people were excited. And he said, so I asked him, why are they all so upbeat? And he said, and it still kind of gives me chills every time I read it, he said that they were optimistic because they're connected with the most powerful geologic force, which is life. Most of what we take to be the physical environment is the creation of living organisms over time. That's a different paradigm than the idea that life is a fragile passenger on a dead planet. So we're not a fragile passenger on a dead planet. We have powerful allies in the soil, and we're understanding more about what they do and how our actions either help or hurt them, and we can play a role in helping them by the food that we choose to eat, by the way that we treat our own land. It's not just farmers, all of us have parklands nearby, some of us have lawns, some of us have gardens. And by the kind of choices that we tell our government to make about how it spends our tax dollars on agriculture. And, not that it's a slam dunk, of course, because there are really, really powerful vested interests that in conventional agriculture who stand to lose billions, if we change the way we do agriculture, even if we change the way that we take care of our lawns and our gardens. But we have allies, and I like to think of the life forms in the soil as heroes of the underground. I grew up watching maybe watching Hogan's Heroes, like I said, heroes of the underground. And I like to think that all of us can be heroes of the underground too. So thank you. Am I supposed to stay here?
Yes. It's getting late, but thank you so much. That was very inspiring, and I think sets a really important tone for the conference, and thank you for your work.
Thank you. It's great to be around all of you.
Yeah. So if anybody has questions, we can take them now. Kristin's going to be hanging out a little tonight, and then tomorrow you'll be here. Mm-hmm. But she'll be signing books tonight, if anybody is interested in that. Oh, question?
Here. I've already got the mic, so
Fantastic.
Danger. I wanted to ask you a little bit about no-till. We toured an organic farm today, and the farmer told us that he does till because in Maine, in the climate here, the growing season is so short that he feels that it wouldn't work well unless he, unless he used an herbicide and killed the cover crop in the spring, I guess. I wonder if that's anything that you might have heard from anybody who you spoke to in your research.
Well, I think it's, farmers deal with such different conditions, different soils, different crops, different weather, different terrain, all of that at different size. All of that varies so much, and I think that there are, it's tricky, and I wouldn't say to that farmer. I heard him say that, and I think Gabe Brown. I asked him about that once. I said, especially a lot of organic farmers who can't deal with weeds with herbicides, so they till. And I asked him, what about that? What about that? And he said, anybody can do no-till. It's just, you just have to wrestle around with it. So I think that there is a growing movement. What Gabe talks about as the holy grail is organic no-till, and there are some researchers working on that. I mean, he's doing organic no-till now, although he's not, I don't think he's certified. He might be certified. So he really changed his farm after, in the 4 years since I was there. But I think that it's always a question of juggling around and seeing what you can make work. I think that the overall goal always has to be, though, trying to focus on soil health and doing what you can for that. And so he was doing some great stuff out there with the leaves and other things.
I'm just an amateur.
You're just a bee.
Thank you very much. Not for the bee thing, but for your presentation. Is my on? There we go. Bzz. Now you get it. Can you hear me now? Bzz. You talked about black soil being dyed. And
Not soil, the mulch bags
the mulch,
that
what you
people
buy,
buy.
yeah. Do they say they're dyed?
Yeah,
But you have to check.
yeah.
Because we've always been, oh, that's black gold, that's great. But you never know until you check that it's dyed.
Yeah, some of those bags do say that they are.
Probably not in very big letters, right? But that is like, as a home gardener, it's kind of shocking to know that they're tricking us to that extent. It's like spraying red dye on strawberries or something. It's like, thanks for warning us.
Yeah, hi. I was wondering what you thought the biggest impediment to a broader adoption of these practices are. Is it lack of knowledge? Is it lack of skill? Is it lack of courage, maybe?
It's all those things. I mean, where Gabe farms in Bismarck, I mean, I think people ask me that question a lot, and there are some people who could, as I say, a lot of these changes are really simple. I mean, no change is completely simple, but some of the, it's not like, they aren't immensely difficult changes to make. But the way people change is mysterious, and I think lots of times it takes a very difficult situation, it takes running into a brick wall to make a turn, which is what happened with Gabe. And what happened, and that's kind of what happened with the farmers in Australia that I was talking to. Climate change has hit very hard there, so they're really having to change things that they did before and do things that, as farmers, they considered sort of like, God, we would never do that. But I think it's a combination of all those things. It's education getting out, it's support. There are some government programs that fund farmers who are trying to move over to go no-till and make other changes that would be beneficial for the land. And surprisingly, it surprised me anyway, they had way, way more demand than they had money for. So I think if more, and then there was just the news the other day that a House committee wants to strip $6 billion out of the Farm Bill for conservation programs, and that's exactly the opposite directions that we need to go. So the farmers that are getting like payment for like 3 years to transition over to no-till, that's the kind of money that this committee wants to strip out of the Farm Bill. So we need to go the complete opposite direction and give, farmers have this constellation of living things that they sink an awful lot of money into. Some farmers take out loans of $500,000 at the beginning of the growing season. So the idea of changing what they were taught in school and maybe what their father did, and what all their neighbors are doing, and what their seed dealer says that they should do, and all this these people, the culture of agriculture is still telling farmers to do things a very different way. So to change that is very scary. So I think education, I think money, pressure from consumers. The food movement is making a huge impact on what farmers are doing.
We have one right here.
You partially answered it with the answer to the last question. I was going to ask about policy change, but what about things like tax credits, especially or even statewide, like a state like California where there's so much agriculture? Are there things that the California state government could or should do that would encourage farmers to move in that direction?
There's some elected leader in California who has proposed dollars to reward farmers for building up soil carbon. Have you heard about that? There is. I can't remember his name right now and what it is. But yeah, there are. I think California is sort of ahead of anybody else in trying to put some dollars to that.
There's a cap and trade program in California, and they're using cap and trade money to try to sequester carbon in a whole bunch of different ways. And then the second comment I wanted to make is, we're trying to do no-till on our farm in Vermont, and we have about the same climate as Maine, except a little worse. And so it is difficult. Everything we've tried in agriculture for the last 47 years since we switched over to organic has been difficult, whether it's growing artichokes in Vermont or dry beans in Vermont. It's, you've got to go through, it's not trial and success, it's trial and error, and you make a lot of mistakes. And last year we did no-till, and we tried to cobble together a lot of our equipment to do it, and we cobbled together failure. And, so this year we got Dr. Bronner to buy us some equipment that was no-till equipment, and so we're giving it another try. We don't think we got enough mass in our cover crop to suppress the weeds, right? So this year we increased the amount of seed we're putting in from 120 pounds to 200 pounds per acre, right? And so all of it is like, look, we've got to fix this. When we started switching over to organic, we really just stopped using chemicals. We didn't stop bad land management. And so that's what we have to fix.
Right.
And that's what we need to fix right now. And it's not going to be easy, and it takes time, but we're really hopeful about it. And we talked to the farmers today when we were on that tour, and they're wonderful folks. And, we'll work together now. We went to Rodale last week, and we're going to work with them on projects. And so that's where people are going right now. And I think it's very hopeful, and so don't give up. We're working on it, and a lot of people are working on it. So,
Right here.
And I think also this approach, this understanding, it is like the understanding of the human body. That understanding of what's going on in the soil is really new. So there's a lot of rethinking and rejiggering, and there's when the NRCS goes around and does these they do these workshops all over the country with farmers and farm educators about soil health. And they love to quote some guy, and I can't remember the guy's name, but it's some guy who says, if you want small change, change the way you do things. If you want big change, change the way you see things. They love that quote. But I think that what is going on is a very big change in the way that we see things. And the way we used to see things in agriculture was an awful lot about what goes on above the soil line. And now it's like this it's a much bigger look at the ecosystem. The ecosystem isn't just here, it's like this.
So, yeah, I think this is a really important discussion about what makes change and what the obstacles to change. Is this working?
Yeah, I just couldn't see where the voice comes from all over it. I couldn't see who.
But I just wanted to say, I've worked with farmers, alternative farmers, but I've also participated or observed what's going on with conventional farmers, including very recently in my county in upstate New York. And I think one of the obstacles is that people, they might be interested in better methods, but they don't see any larger reason because the ideology remains pretty much the same, that there's these crazy environmentalists out there saying there's problems, but those problems, they're just made up. They're just like figments of the urban population's imagination or something like that. It's very hard for people, so it's really taboo. You go to I went to a part of a workshop on no-till. It was very herbicide intensive. One of the farmers was using cocktails of cover crops. The other one was not. But there's not a word said about the dangers of Roundup or other herbicides. It's like totally taboo. So farmers only get a little piece of the puzzle.
Right.
And that to me is one of the largest obstacles. I mean, farmers are rightfully very risk adverse. So if there were safe ways to try in a small area with a small thing so they could see some changes. But I think overwhelmingly it's that there's nothing wrong with the system, we just got to fine tune it. And that's what makes it so hard to bring about change. And then crop insurance covers, to some extent, their losses. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's, yeah.
Well, I think that for me, one of the things that's really hopeful, is that a lot of farmers are making changes because they're making more money. They're making more money if they're not doing the tillage and if they're not using spending all that money on chemicals. They are making more money. So that, I mean, even if farmers have, and there was a really interesting study that came out last year saying that the reasons that farmers change or don't change, conventional to organic to regenerative, which is what I'm calling this other thing, is ideological. It's sort of their view of the world and how the world works. It's a difference in what they see, or how they see things. But one of the things that can break through that philosophical difference, though, is if somebody can make an awful lot more money. Yeah.
I'm on the edges of the Portland Food Council, which should have its bylaws like by the end of this month. And food councils are coming up all over the United States, and who knows where else. And their goal is to make the borders of Portland food self-sufficient.
Cool.
And yeah, my question comes from so many different directions, and then I'm going to hit you. I should warn you ahead of time. I grew up on a country road that was, the creation around us was just bursting with life. And when I was about 8, they paved the road, so I spent my later childhood watching everything get run over and disappear and polluted and destroyed. So you should know ahead of time I'm anti-pavement.
Okay.
So this creation was built on 3 molecules of carbon per 10,000 molecules of everything else, and we're up between 11 and 14 molecules of carbon, and creation is literally breaking down. If we eliminated the vehicles from our communities and put in these cover crops instead of this asphalt, wouldn't that help a lot? I mean, to get it back to what it was only 120 years ago?
If I understand you correctly, I think that I think that the more that we can free the earth from asphalt and other impermeable surfaces and let water drain in and soil breathe and plant more things, absolutely. I think we ought to be planting things. I've become like this nut. I walk around my neighborhood and I stop in front of somebody's house if I see like this much bare soil and I'm like, oh, that's terrible. But I think that wherever we can, wherever there's any land that can be planted, best to get something growing on it. Especially, so many areas have. So many agricultural areas have eliminated weedy, non-crop plants, and there's nothing for the pollinators to eat. The more that we can get plants growing near agricultural areas, growing in cities, food for the pollinators. We have 4,000 wild pollinators in the United States, and we only think about honeybees. But if we had more plants out there, flowering plants feeding all those wild pollinators, everything would be growing better. Almost.
Hi. I appreciate what you said, and I think the dedication to the soil is really critical. And I wanted to bring it to a kind of a main example. 2 or 3 years ago, Ray Archuleta from NRCS, I'm from the northern part of the state, which is potato country, and he came and he brought Craig Rocky from San Luis Valley in Colorado, a major potato producing county. And he spoke to about 150 Aroostook County potato farmers about the same concept that Gabe Brown has, only Gabe is into beef cattle and these are potato farmers. So Craig Rocky's idea is cropping potatoes every other year and then using a cover crop cocktail in the off year and actually refining that now and putting cover crops in between the potato plants in rows so you're getting some benefit over that year. And he has, like Gabe, he has dramatically cut down the input cost of growing his crops to the point where he's mainly buying seed. He's not like Gabe. He's not buying the chemicals, and he's getting good crops. And this is in the context of, yields in Aroostook County have leveled off or are declining, whereas in other areas they're continuing to go up. But I think there's a recognition nationally that we're approaching a catastrophe with poor land management, and it's not the farmers' fault. I think the farmers are generally doing the best job they can, and it kind of traces back to the cheap food policy of trying to produce food as cheaply as possible, and you just can't keep taking and taking without giving back. So I spoke to Craig Rocky afterwards and Ray Archuleta after their presentation. It was such a strong presentation that really it was shaking up the status quo, and I said, how did you ever get NRCS in Washington, D.C. to approve this? So there's another Maine connection here. Ray Archuleta, who was, and they've gone, I think Maine was one of the last of the 50 states that they'd gone to, but they've done this same procedure, and you can go online and you can watch these videos, and they're quite interesting. I think it's the same kind of dog and pony show around the country. But his boss was Wayne Honeycutt, Dr. Wayne Honeycutt, who started out as an organic farmer in North Dakota about 30 years ago, and he became the director of the Ag Research Lab, USDA Ag Research Lab at Orono, Maine. So we knew that he had left Maine when Obama got elected, and he came to be the head scientist for NRCS. So with that background and that main connection, right up to USDA Secretary Vilsack, I think there's recognition that we have a looming disaster and that there needs to be a real reverse course and a new attention paid to soil. So that has how this is percolated down, and that there were so many farmers attending that. It's just something I've never, in 40 years, I've never seen anything like that. And then the final step in this story is the local Soil and Water Conservation District got a grant, and they're working with our Mark Fulford, who's an organic soils consultant that we've worked with for 12 years. And they've got 3 progressive farmers that are incorporating this Craig Rocky technique of how he's doing things in San Luis Valley, trying it out in Aroostook County. And the Aroostook County potato farmers are a pretty tough nut to crack, but to get this kind of on-the-ground experience, and as Will said, it's trial and error, and they're trying to invent something that's never been done before, but it's happening even here in Maine, and I think it's a